Welcome to the Springs in the Desert podcast. We're so happy that you're here with us. We're those friends that you can take with you wherever you are on the path of infertility.
Hello, and welcome to the Springs in the Desert podcast. I'm Ann, and I am here with my friend Cassandra. Hi, Cassandra.
Hi.
Well, we have another great episode for you. We want to just jump right into it because we are bringing back a guest that we spoke with about her book, When Expecting Doesn't Happen, Turning Infertility into a Journey of Hope. And that is Dr. Marie Meany. Marie is a specialist on the French philosopher and mystic Simone Weil, on whom she has written 2 books. And she holds graduate degrees in modern languages and philosophy from Oxford University and the International Academy of Philosophy in Liechtenstein. She taught at the University of Villanova in Philadelphia before the birth of her daughter. And her previous work on infertility has been published in French, German, Croatian, Hungarian, and Spanish. And so we are so blessed to welcome back our guest, Marie Meany, to discuss this beautiful book. Hi, Marie.
Hi, Ann. Hi, Cassandra. Lovely to be back.
Great to have you. And I just want to remind everyone that if you missed our first conversation with Marie, you can go back and listen to season 3, episode 51. And you can hear more about Marie's story and some of the wisdom that we unpacked from her book. So, Marie, last time you were with us, we talked about the experience of infertility from the perspective of those of us who actually struggle with us. We talked a bit about how the people around us can kind of support and encourage us as we're carrying this particular cross of infertility. But we wanted to have you back to dive into the section of your book that addresses ART, or artificial reproductive technologies. And we just want to acknowledge that this can be a really sensitive issue, that the church has spoken on the issue of these technologies and the way science is moving. I'm sure there's going to be more that come about that we're going to kind of have to deal with. Morally speaking, but it's a subject that even so creates this conflict and even confusion within us, especially when we are so strongly desiring a child and going through infertility. So before we kind of jump into that, can you just share with those who might not be familiar with that term what we mean by ART, artificial reproductive technologies, and maybe a couple of examples?
Absolutely. So as the term says, it's about helping people in their reproduction through the means of artificial technology. So in and of itself, it's a very neutral term. It doesn't tell you yet anything about whether the kinds of technologies there are, whether they're right or wrong. There's obviously nothing wrong with science, nor anything artificial, nor has the church ever seen any problem with science. I mean, it was sort of at the source of it. And we use a lot of artificial things in our lives all the time. My eyeglasses, this computer, there's nothing unethical about it. But the question is, when we look at arts, at artificial reproductive technologies, does it actually assist reproduction? Does it heal the couple? Or does it replace it? And these are 2 very different things. I think most people who are suffering from infertility, they would love to have a child the normal way. They want to be healed. That's what they want to do. And even if they go the route of IVF, I think they prefer that they didn't have to, and that it wasn't something so technical, something so clinical, where they're sort of not involved in the actual conception of their child. So that's the one question we have to ask ourselves when you look at artificial reproductive technologies. Another question is, does it go against the dignity of the child, the spouses, the marriage, or not? Because the church, again, to repeat it, it's not against science. It was instrumental in bringing it about, but it evaluates science. It sees, is it for a good or not? And I think we're all aware today that technology can bring about a great good, but also terrible evil. We can create Frankensteins and do terrible things to people through science. So we have to be careful. And I think the church is clearly wanting to help us and guide us in terms of, what is acceptable and what is not, what is actually guiding us onto the path of life and what is not. So, in terms of what is out there, IVF, everybody knows that, in vitro fertilization, where a sperm is collected and eggs, and they're assembled in a petri dish in a lab and left to reproduce, and then after a few days inserted into the woman with a hope that the baby will implant and then come to term. And there are different ways of making that work better. So there are different variations on that, which we don't need to go into. Cloning is another technology that a lot of people have problems with, and rightly so. But then there are a lot of morally acceptable technologies, like giving hormones to modulate the menstrual cycle, surgery to fix fallopian tube problems or the uterus or endometriosis, fertility drugs to address anovulation, help male infertility, premature ejaculation. There's lots out there. And then a wonderful approach, which is that, as you probably all know, of Dr. Hilgers in Omaha, Nebraska, who invented NAPRO technology and has great success in treating couples who are suffering from infertility with a much higher rate of success than, for example, IVF.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I appreciated, Marie, about your book was the way that you address ART in a way that I think is so gentle and loving. And, you spoke a little bit, we'll talk a little bit more about the church specifically. I think one of the things that certainly our culture, our society misunderstands, and even some of us, within the church, kind of view the church as this sort of hammer that says, we want to squash all your fun. We want to take away all the good things, right?
No, and you can't do that.
Exactly. And that's how so many, even within the church, we might see the things that she says in that way. But, the church is our mother. And so it's not a matter of sort of laying down a hammer, but speaking and pronouncing on these things in a way that shows, as you said, respect for the dignity of the child, of the marriage, of the human person, and to really safeguard us, to safeguard our bodies and our spirits and our emotions as well. And so I think when we talk about these kinds of technologies, it's important to see that what the church says is said from a place of real love and concern and care for us. And so, again, I really love how you address it in the book, because that desire to have a child is good, and it's it's very strong. And I think no one who's suffering through infertility or loss is trying to do something that's morally or ethically wrong. But, again, there's some confusion out there, or just that desire can kind of overtake us and almost blind us in a way. So I like how you begin in your book, you begin the discussion of ART by framing it in terms of God's plan and what you call the church's anthropological and ethical approach. So I think that's a great starting place. Can you tell us what that means and why that should be our starting point when we look at ART, or even when we're looking at the illicit treatments like NAPRO technology for infertility?
Yes, of course. So I think, first of all, if we're in such a situation of pain, then anybody who seems to tell us that we may not go that route, which seems to be to us the only way that we will have a child, it will feel harsh. So, because you are this bundle of soreness and of wounds and of pain, and then to feel that, it just feels like, oh no, this person is trying to cut me off from the one thing that seems to be getting me there. So I think it's important to see, why is the church saying what it is saying? And then, as we will do further on in this podcast, is to talk about what IVF really is and what is happening and how inhuman it is in many ways. And how once you realize that, you may feel less tempted to go that route. So, God's plan for us, as we know, was a wonderful one before the fall, but it continues even after the fall, even though now, unfortunately, though he gave us this command, this vocation to be fruitful and multiply, though some of us can't do that, at least not in that way. But what he continues to want to teach us, what has become so much harder to us since the fall, is this: to learn again to speak the language of love. And we have a hard time doing that, and especially when we're in pain. So let's take an example that doesn't have to do with infertility. Let's say you have a really difficult marriage and you suffer a lot under your marriage. And then there comes somebody else who seems to fit you so much better. And it just suddenly becomes so tempting to leave your unhappy marriage behind and try a new life with that new person. And what's before you thought, no, that's wrong, I would never do that. Suddenly, that seems really right. And anybody telling you that you shouldn't be doing that seems very harsh. And God isn't telling us that we're not allowed to do adultery because he's against love. It's because he wants to teach us the language of love. And the language of love means that we have to stay, even in situations that are very painful, staying with a spouse who is perhaps not being very kind to us, or we have a difficult marriage for whatever reason. And being in that situation of infertility, even though we hope it's not permanent, and trying to find ways that are in accordance with his law of life and of love, because only that will make us truly happy. Now, that's really what the 10 Commandments are about. And when the church tells us something we shouldn't do, it's not, as you were saying, simply because it wants to make life hard to us, but because we need to be told again these things that we've forgotten how to do and how to speak. The church sometimes has to express itself in a very technical way, because some of these bioethical issues are so complicated that it sounds very technical and artificial. But it really isn't. It shouldn't make us overlook that, what the 10 Commandments are about, Christ's Beatitudes. It is all about teaching us the ways of life. So the couple who suffers and who would love to have a child, seems like anything that should help them should be good. Therefore, clearly, and it's being offered to us in society so widely. At the same time, we all have our line in the sand. Even if we feel we're being pulled in a certain direction, and I think we'd all say, to kill, for example, this is not what happened. I mean, we'll see what happens exactly, but we wouldn't kill another child just so that we can have one. Okay, that's an extreme example. But if we look at the way IVF works, I think we will be able to see that it is quite an inhuman and anti-human technology. Now, if you look at the witnesses of adults who have been conceived through IVF, they speak about their suffering of having been conceived in a lab, that it wasn't in the embrace of their parents, that it was technicians, doctors who decided which child will live, which child will be implanted, which child will be discarded, which child will be frozen. Children are in a very, very vulnerable situation at that point, and they should be nestled in the womb of their mother and not out there in a lab where anything could happen to them that the parents have no control over. And I think we're so keenly aware of that today. We realize when we are expecting, we want to do everything that's good for our child. We sing to our child already. We want to avoid all trauma, all fright, all stress. And somehow we think that the moment of conception, that is so important, somehow wouldn't matter for the child. Mm-hmm. I mentioned in my book the witness of a prenatal psychologist who treats children who have been conceived through IVF and deals with their trauma. And he mentions one child who said in a dream, she didn't know that she'd been conceived through IVF, and she didn't know about her having any siblings, but she had this dream of 7 siblings being in a dark, cold place, crying. And the parents were very struck with that, So how could that child know? I don't know.
Oh my.
And I hope, that all children who are conceived through IVF are ultimately not traumatized by it. But the point is then is putting them into a situation where they could very easily be traumatized, because it is a traumatizing situation. Okay, it is. And if we think of all the children that die in the process of IVF. I think that should make us ponder too. So in 2018, it was estimated that 8 million children had been born through IVF, which means that about 72 million children died in the process. Because up till recently, a child only had about 10% chance of survival. So 72 million children have died. What other kind of medical technology would we allow with that kind of loss of life? We wouldn't. But we allow it in this case because people are desperate, which, I understand, and because there's a lot of money involved in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
So, what spouses, as I mentioned, really want, they want to be healed. They want to have a child the natural way. They want it to come about through spousal embrace. They don't want it to go through a lab. And, people nowadays speak very openly as to how difficult IVF has been on them, on their marriage, how traumatizing for the woman to have to take all those hormones, for the husband to masturbate, often while watching porn on his phone. I mean, this is just awful. What kind of a beginning of life is that? And very, very unpleasant for the parents, even those who are in favor of IVF. So don't get me wrong, every child is of infinite value, has an infinite dignity. Also those, of course, that now have been conceived for IVF. But it's precisely because of that infinite dignity of the child that the church is coming down on IVF, because it is going against it and is creating potentially a terrible wound in the child because it's being objectified. And we see psychologically how not enough studies have been done about this because it's just not something that science really wants to look at. They want to happily continue with IVF.
Right.
But, there are some studies out there, and you see psychologists finding the kind of survivor's guilt of the children that have been conceived through IVF, because why are they alive? Why are some of their siblings still frozen in somewhere? Why have others been discarded? They must be somehow worthy of their survival. So they feel either that they have to really prove themselves and be overachievers, or they just throw up their hands in despair and say, well, I can't do this anyway, and fall into depression. So, and I'm not saying that all IVF children do that. I'm just saying that that's a path something that can happen more easily. And then we get into the whole issue of if you have gamete donation, so if you use the sperm or the eggs of a donor because one of the spouses has such issues that you can't use theirs. And then we get into a whole new problem of the poor children and grown-ups then having to deal with not knowing that one of their parents, suffering from not knowing their family, worrying about falling in love with somebody who might be related to them, and really, in a way, crushing them as adopted children aren't. You'd think, well, adopted children also may not know anything about their family of origin, and they should be thinking about their family of origin just as much and just as worried about falling in love with somebody they were like, but they don't. It's like a 70% difference, and you wonder why. And I think this is pointing us in the direction, empirically speaking, that there's something fundamentally wrong with this whole technology. And that's why I did this chapter then also on just pulling on the kind of research that we have, which is not absolutely conclusive. I don't claim it to be, and I'm not a specialist, but I think that's pointing us to something that says, if you do something that's wrong, it will have consequences, and you will be able to notice them if you keep your eyes open.
It just reminds me, and I love, just to back up a little bit, what you said about the 10 Commandments, because we hear throughout the scriptures and the Psalms and the prophets that these prophets saying, I love your law, and I think sometimes in our path of spiritual growth, there's times where we feel like the 10 Commandments and God's law and the things the church says are, as I was kind of joking before, like the no, you can't do that. But as we grow, we begin to see that the commandments are the path of life, and what comes down in the law and through the church are meant to guide us to live life and, to not hurt others. When I was an immature college kid and not doing certain things just because the church told me not to. And, it's good that, if you are kept on the path, even for kind of like a negative reason and you
Absolutely.
haven't reached, full maturity, but to understand it's like, no, like those things go against love, and God is love. And I think it's the same when we are in this place of darkness, to be tempted to do things that we think will fix the problem, but end up causing all of these other issues that you have touched on. And it's just so complicated, but there has to be a movement, in the spirit of trust and love, that God is love and life.
And I think that's also so much part of our original wound in a way. Adam and Eve, they hid from God. So yes, they did something wrong, but they could have run to him as his loving children and said they were sorry, and they didn't. And the serpent had already put into their minds this idea that God was preventing them from eating from that tree because he wanted to keep them down. So suddenly they saw God in a wrong way. And I think we tend to do that too. We somehow deep down, we're always afraid that God doesn't really want our happiness, and that he's sort of keeping something back from us. And then the church as well, in a way. And that's, I think, also part of our process here of our life of spiritual life, to learn how to trust God more and more, and to know that even when things are difficult and when we're on the cross, it's not because he doesn't love us. It's not because he doesn't want our happiness. But if we choose a different path from his, then we will find ourselves like the prodigal son, who will be with the swine and finding himself hungry and starving and realizing that the path he chose was a dead end and having to return.
And it always strikes me too how God then makes Adam and Eve, he makes their clothes.
I know. He's such a caring father.
And then like the welcoming back of the prodigal son, like there is redemption, for all of us in Christ, and through the sacrament of confession, there's that message of hope and God's love.
Absolutely. And all those couples who've done IVF and have children, God is with you. This is not a place of despair. There's lots of healing that's available. And you were mentioning confession, and God never leaves us alone. He always walks with us.
Yeah, that's such an important point, because I'm thinking about, even faithful Catholics who may or may not know or understand what the church teaches about ART. I mean, I have a master's in theology. When I was at my lowest point, it crossed my mind,
Of course. Of course.
Because, this is part of the human condition, the suffering and wanting to alleviate it. It's interesting because there was a Pew Research study in 2013. I don't know if there's been another since, but it said that 77% of Catholics believe that IVF is either morally acceptable or not a moral issue. So, that's one of the reasons that, we're kind of picking on IVF. You talk about some other things in your book. I appreciate how starkly you laid it out for us here, Marie, kind of what is really involved, and not just the spiritual, but also the emotional and the physical kind of consequences. And, I want to acknowledge that there are people out there, and even in our community, who may have resorted to IVF, or perhaps they're considering it right now. And so this has been a very frank and sort of stark conversation. But as we just said, God is with us in all of it. And so, if we've gone off the path, if we've made mistakes, or if we have a child who was born through the process of IVF, that child is good, is loved, has an immortal soul. They're not, this sort of other kind of thing. We're all on this path in the Christian life, right? Doing our best and making mistakes, but always, seeking that redemption and that restoration in Christ.
I would like to add something to that. I was very struck by the quote of an adult who was conceived through IVF, and who said, my mother or parents, I don't remember what she said, they had a tremendous cross. They had a tremendous suffering. She didn't use religious terms. They had a tremendous suffering. But instead of carrying it, they put it on my shoulders. And I thought, wow, that puts things in a very different light. And that made me think, in a way, even as a couple suffering from infertility, having no children, I can make a choice as a parent, because what do? Parents choose what is good for their children. So I'm undergoing a tremendous tragedy, which is infertility. It's tremendous. It's heartbreaking. It's life-changing. You're not the same anymore afterwards. At the same time, it's still something different what I would do to my child, because the one is, just random suffering that happens, and the other is turning the child into a commodity, whether I want that or not. I may love that child to bits, absolutely. Parents of IVF children, I'm sure they're fantastic parents. They can be fantastic parents. There's no doubt about it. But the point is that the child at the moment of conception was turned into a commodity, was produced in a lab in circumstances that should not have happened in that way. And that is potentially can create a big wound in the child. And that is what the church calls a sin. It is going against the dignity of the child. And there is something so much worse in the suffering that one feels that happens through sin than the suffering one experiences through sickness. So let me give you an example. You have a dear friend, best friend, soulmate. That friend dies. Terrible tragedy. You weep, you suffer, you miss that friend to bits. Other option, that friend decides to break off from you, break that relationship, and leave. And no, you haven't done anything. It's not like this is in response to something terrible that you've done. That creates a tremendous wound, which is very different than just the pain of losing that person. That friend, in a way, sinned against me, turned, our precious friendship, turned against me and hurt my heart, wounded my heart. Perhaps because she felt she wanted to be with more popular people or whatever. But the point is that I, as a potential parent, can make that choice. What do I want for my child? And there are methods that are perfectly in harmony with the dignity of the child. I was mentioning NAPRO technology and Creighton method and other things that you can do. And there are fortunately those that do grievously wound the child potentially, and also the couple. And let me just as an aside say that marriages where they use in vitro, and especially then use heterologous in vitro, so that means using the sperm or the ovum of another couple, very interestingly, the marriage breaks in terms of if you look at the percentage of it, breaks within a few years. Much higher than, for example, with adoption, where you also have a different child coming who's not biologically related to you, enters into your home. So again, there's something there that is happening that is not right. And you can go on these websites of people who have been conceived through IVF and read their witnesses and see what that's like. And of course, they're grateful to be there, and we rejoice that they're there. That's the thing. Once the baby is there, we're happy. It's there, and God loves it, and we all will hopefully love it. But the thing is, we don't want to put people into that situation of being so wounded and want to choose a path of life.
I feel like, they talk about the hard sayings of Jesus. I feel like what we've been discussing here are the kind of hard sayings. They're the hard things, but they are the important things for anyone to consider when we're going through infertility and we're considering what kind of treatment or intervention. These are such important questions. And I think probably many times they're not asked or they don't occur to the couple, especially, we see now all of these celebrities and they're telling their IVF stories and they're, so it can seem, it can seem just sort of very innocuous, very like, oh, this famous person did it and, it worked out, or it didn't work out, but, oh, well, they tried. And so you sort of see that and you think the process is not quite as complicated as you have really uncovered here when you go deep and you ask those kind of important questions about this kind of a process. It's much more complicated emotionally, physically, spiritually than we might think when we're kind of in the midst of our
Yeah.
suffering.
Yeah. That's why the witness
Yeah.
is so important, of people who have either gone through it or who have not. And I think they can really speak to us who are in that situation. So those who have gone through it and who regret it, they can tell us why. and and those who haven't can then also be great witnesses, because as we've been saying all along, it is so tremendously painful that it can be very hard to tell to couples who are suffering from this, no, you shouldn't be going that route. As you said, it's like a hard saying. It's already so painful. It seems like you just made this pain a lot worse. But I think people who've been through this and can speak about this in a different way, because they've had to shoulder the consequences of going that route or of not going that route. And I have to say, so the friends I have who have not gone that route, I don't know, I mean, from what they told me, they didn't regret it. But, even if they had, sometimes we have those moments where we do something right, and then afterwards it may still be hard, it's still be with us. But I think it's different than when you do something that you're really not supposed to do. It haunts you in a different way. But anyway, God is with us in all of this.
Yeah, amen. Oh, Marie, this is such an amazing conversation. I wish that we could keep going, but there's so much more in When Expecting Doesn't Happen, turning infertility into a journey of hope. Just maybe you could give us, sort of leave us with a last bit of kind of encouragement for those of us who grapple with the suffering of infertility, perhaps those of us who are discerning treatment and maybe even getting a little bit lured by some of these interventions that are not just immoral, but that are not good for us in any way, as we've been talking about. What's a last piece of advice or encouragement you can leave us with?
What made a huge difference for me was when I realized I didn't have to accept infertility for the rest of my life. It was always thinking about the years ahead that made it seem absolutely impossible. And then I came to see all I have to do is accept the present moment. Not even the whole of today, just the present moment. And God is giving me the grace for the present moment. He's not giving me the grace already ahead for 10 years from now. That's why it seems so impossible for me to be able to face that. And I have no idea what might have happened in 10 years from now. I might be in a very different place. Perhaps I have children, perhaps I don't. But perhaps I can deal with it in a completely different way. And I find the example of Chiara Corbella, whom I mentioned in my book, such a beautiful one. Though her story is a little bit different from ours. But she was this Italian woman who died at the age of 27, about 10 years ago. She married young, and her first two children were severely handicapped and died within an hour or two after birth. And each time they realized during pregnancy that something was very wrong, that the child would die. And they held their child, gave all their love they had, baptized it, and then were surprised at this mixture of joy and grief. They were expecting just to be stricken down by grief, but they weren't. They had both. And then she had a third pregnancy, and this time the child was fine, but she developed a cancer in the mouth that normally older men who smoked all their lives get, and she never smoked. And she wanted to save the child, so she only got treatment that wouldn't harm her little boy, and she gave birth. And then a year later, she died. And her husband was talking to her and said a day before she died, God, Christ says that his yoke is light. Do you find that the cross is light? And she said, oh, it is dolce. It is very sweet, which perhaps it speaks to you, perhaps you just find it horrible, but she clearly was in a position where she was able to say that. But they were able to do that because how he explains it is they did piccoli passi. They did little steps every day. They didn't decide in advance, how's it going to be, in 9 months from now, or whatever, 5 months from now, when our first child is born, when our second child is born, when she has cancer, and what's going to happen. And therefore they were able to go this amazing journey. And, I wouldn't be surprised if she were canonized one day, and she's having a tremendous impact. When her husband is going around giving talks, and we heard him too, and her spiritual director when we were living in Italy. And so choose the small steps of the everyday and let God take care of the bigger picture. And then you can get up the mountain. Otherwise, you can't.
That takes so much pressure off, doesn't it? To not have to kind of get the whole future figured out, but to just take it one step at a time. When we last visited, I wrote down that you said in the suffering there is a call. So maybe to try to see how in every one of those little small steps in the present moment, what's the call? What's the call? And I don't have to worry about, what's the purpose of my whole marriage? What's the call right now in this moment, in this suffering, or in this joy I'm experiencing, only this moment. Yeah, I'm going to be pondering that one for a while. Thank you for sharing that with us, Marie. It has been such a pleasure. We're so grateful to have had this time with you. Once again, we want to highly recommend Dr. Marie Meaney's book, When Expecting Doesn't Happen, Turning Infertility into a Journey of Hope. So please go and pick up a copy. This is such an encouraging and a hopeful book. Marie, thank you once again for sharing your time with us.
Not at all. Thank you so much for having me on your wonderful show. And thank you for the amazing work that you're doing. It's truly beautiful. I wish you'd been around 20 years ago.
Thank you.
That's why we founded Springs in the Desert, because we wish that there was we wish that there was this kind of support. So we're just so grateful to you for what you're doing, grateful to God that we're able to do this work. Cassandra, I'm grateful that you were here with me today too.
Thanks, Ann. I'm grateful for you.
And we are, of course, grateful for everyone in this community. So thank you so much, friends, for being with us for another episode of the Springs in the Desert podcast. And until next time, it is our honor to walk with you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Springs in the Desert podcast episode. If you have a minute, please rate and review us so that we can reach more listeners. Check out our social media pages on Facebook and Instagram, and go to our website, springsinthedesert.org, where you can sign up for our newsletter and hear about more things that we have going on. Most importantly, remember that God loves you so much, and so do we.